June 6, 1944, 15 hours, strong point WN62, Omaha Beach. Gerhard Heinrich Seo methodically maintained his MG-42 machine gun inside the concrete fortification that commanded a view of the channel. In his jacket pocket rested a folded letter from his girlfriend in Metzingen, assuring him she would remain faithful until the conclusion of the war. Just 3 days prior, he had penned a message to her with the confidence of a man certain of victory shortly after Field Marshal Rommel had personally inspected the defensive positions. Rommel had scrutinized Seo's gun slit, carefully examining the overlapping fields of fire, and had given a satisfied nod. "This beach will become their tomb," the field marshal had stated, anticipating the imminent Allied landing. Through the narrow gun opening, Seo saw only darkness stretching across the water, the night calm and quiet, almost serene. Yet in less than half a day, this same soldier would be found in a state of utter shock, tears streaming as he crouched among 13,500 spent shell casings, his MG-42 overheated and distorted. Before him, an Allied invasion force of unprecedented scale would move relentlessly forward, an image too immense for the human mind to fully register. Later, Seo would claim to have inflicted up to 2,000 casualties, but historians regard such numbers as implausible, given that total American losses at Omaha Beach across all causes numbered roughly 2,400. The inevitability of German defeat on D-Day was not to be captured in strategic evaluations or intelligence summaries. Rather, it would be recorded in the first-hand accounts of defenders witnessing the largest amphibious assault in history from positions designed to dominate. The Atlantic Wall extended over 2,400 kilometers from Norway to the Spanish frontier, hailed by Nazi propaganda as an impregnable barrier. Along Normandy's shores, 58 German divisions occupied positions fortified with 17 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel. Adolf Hitler himself had proclaimed these fortifications unassailable. At Omaha Beach, the defensive network exemplified this confidence. U.S. Army historical records describe 8 reinforced bunkers, 35 pillboxes, 4 artillery emplacements, 18 anti-tank guns, 45 rocket launch sites, 85 machine gun nests, and 6 mortar positions. The tidal zones were strewn with over 3,700 obstacles, Belgian gates, Czech hedgehogs, and wooden stakes, many rigged with telemines. Farther inland, 6.5 million mines had been laid, though Rommel's ambition had aimed for 60 million. Colonel Ernst Goth, commanding the 916th Grenadier Regiment near Bayeux, calculated the defensive potential of his sector. With his 4 batteries, he believed they could sustain a rate of fire of 120 rounds per minute onto the designated beach sectors. In conjunction with adjacent batteries, German forces could theoretically focus immense firepower on any landing operation. However, such calculations presupposed an inexhaustible supply of ammunition, a critical assumption that would ultimately prove disastrous. In these hours before dawn, Seo and his fellow defenders remained confident in the fatal efficiency of their preparations, unaware that the scale and determination of the Allied invasion would render even the most elaborate defenses insufficient. On June 5, Paris experienced conditions that Luftwaffe meteorologist Walter Stuber had deemed entirely unsuitable for any amphibious operation. Gusts reached 20 to 25 knots, waves surged to approximately 6 feet, and a low ceiling of clouds hovered around 500 feet. Relying on data collected from U-boat units and local weather stations, Stuber had assured German High Command that unfavorable weather would persist for at least 2 weeks. Confident in this prediction, many senior officers vacated their posts. Rommel himself traveled to Germany on June 5 to celebrate his wife's birthday, bringing along a pair of grey suede shoes purchased in Paris. Meanwhile, General Friedrich Dollmann, in charge of the 7th Army, instructed division leaders to participate in training exercises at Rennes. Even routine naval patrols in the English Channel were called off, deterred by the rough seas. This overconfidence in meteorological analysis would later emerge as Germany's first major error in judgment. Unbeknownst to Stuber, the Allies had access to advanced weather intelligence, including stations in Greenland and reconnaissance flights over the Atlantic, which had detected a temporary lull in the storm. This 36-hour window, pinpointed by Group Captain James Stack, was swiftly acted upon by Eisenhower. By 11:15 p.m. on June 5, radar installations along the Normandy coastline began recording unusual activity. Freya and Würzburg radar systems detected large formations of aircraft approaching from the north. Initially, German operators were skeptical. Previous Allied deception missions had trained them to expect false alarms. However, by 12:30 a.m. on June 6, incoming reports began to challenge all prior assumptions. Entire units of Scheerjager paratroopers were landing across Normandy. Confusion ran deep. Some reports placed paratroopers east, others west. Some claimed they were British, while others identified American troops. Further complicating matters, decoy paratroopers equipped with small explosive devices as part of Operations Titanic and Rupert created additional chaos. Major Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, was among the first officers to comprehend the gravity of the situation. Awakened by reports of paratroopers landing near his positions, he immediately requested authority to engage. Division headquarters, however, instructed him to hold position until the circumstances became clearer. In his memoirs, von Luck reflected on the moment. "I realized instantly that we were at a disadvantage. The paratroopers were clearly marking strategic points for the main landing. Every minute we delayed allowed the Allies to strengthen their positions, yet we were immobilized by the rigidity of our command." By 5:30 a.m. on June 6, as dawn faintly lit the English Channel, German observers stationed along the coast began witnessing a scene that defied all prior training and expectations. Accounts vary regarding the exact individuals who first sighted the Armada. Some sources credit Verlusgart, though his presence remains contested by historians, including Heinrich Seeau. What is indisputable, however, is that observers across Normandy beheld a horizon densely packed with vessels, thousands, not hundreds, stretching as far as the eye could see. The fleet included ships of every size, from colossal battleships to small landing craft, forming an immense, continuous grey expanse that spread across the Channel. The Allied invasion fleet that struck the coast of Normandy on June 6, 1944, represented an unparalleled concentration of naval power. According to official records, the Armada comprised 6,939 vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 auxiliary ships, and 864 merchant vessels. For the German defenders, who had been conditioned by years of propaganda claiming Allied disunity and weakness, the sight of this enormous fleet was profoundly unsettling. Bernhard Furking, an artillery officer stationed at WN-62, later killed during the landing, reportedly told his men that it appeared as though the entire world had come to their shores. At 5:35 hours, the Allies initiated a sustained naval bombardment. German troops, who had endured some of the most intense experiences on the Eastern Front and survived repeated RAF bombing raids, were unprepared for the magnitude of the assault. Records from the Naval History and Heritage Command indicate that the battleship USS Texas alone fired 25,514 shells at Point du Hoc over a 34-minute period. Meanwhile, HMS Warspite, the first ship to engage the Germans on D-Day around 5, would fire more than 315 tons of ordnance over the following 48 hours, including 96 shells specifically targeting German fortifications on June 9. The intensity of the naval bombardment was unprecedented for the Wehrmacht. Testimonies collected by the German Federal Archives describe concrete bunkers designed to endure the heaviest artillery, cracking and collapsing under the relentless shellfire. Soldiers were buried by debris, dug out by comrades, and sometimes struck again as bombardment continued. The psychological effect rivaled the physical destruction. Fortifications once regarded as impenetrable disintegrated, leaving defenders in a state of shock and disorientation. As the naval onslaught persisted, the Luftwaffe's attempts at counteraction highlighted the desperate situation faced by German forces. Oberst Josef Pips Prill, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, received orders to engage the invasion fleet with all available aircraft. His entry in the unit's war diary reflected the grim reality. What entire force? I have two planes. Despite promises of complete air dominance over any Allied landing, the Luftwaffe managed a mere 319 sorties on D-Day, compared to 14,674 sorties launched by the Allies. Prill and his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Wodeschick, carried out the only Luftwaffe attack on the beaches that morning, strafing Sword Beach once in their Fu-190A8 fighters before retreating under overwhelming Allied air cover. This lone sortie, carried out by just 2 aircraft against thousands of enemy vessels, became emblematic of German incapacity. The vaunted Knights of the Sky, once expected to dominate any invasion, had been reduced to a single, ineffectual maneuver. By 6:30 hours, the first waves of assault troops reached the beaches. Despite the heavy naval bombardment, German defenders remained at their positions and engaged the incoming forces. The ensuing combat was a scene of brutal carnage even by the standards of veteran soldiers. Heinrich Seo, manning an MG-42 at WN-62, began firing at 6:35. His emplacement, one of the few spared by the preliminary bombardment, had clear fields of fire across Omaha Beach. In his 2005 memoir WN-62 Erinnerungen an Omaha Beach, Seo recounted firing approximately 13,500 rounds over a 9-hour period. While he claimed high casualty numbers, historians caution that his gun, though lethal, represented only a part of the broader defensive network at Omaha Beach. Nevertheless, the MG-42's rapid-fire capability, 1,200 rounds per minute in short bursts, exerted a devastating effect, contributing heavily to what would be remembered as the Bloody Omaha ordeal. The combination of overwhelming naval firepower, the near absence of Luftwaffe opposition, and well-positioned German defenders created a situation of intense psychological and physical pressure for both sides. Even heavily fortified positions, long thought impregnable, were quickly rendered vulnerable, marking the D-Day landings as one of the most decisive and unprecedented military operations in modern history. During the initial hours of the Normandy landings, German forces began to experience what later military analysts would define as material shock, a severe psychological strain triggered by facing an enemy of overwhelming size and firepower. No matter how many American, British, or Canadian soldiers were neutralized, additional waves constantly replaced them. Landing craft destroyed on the beaches were often substituted by multiple new vessels, and positions silenced by enemy fire were quickly suppressed again under relentless naval bombardment. By late morning, German reports indicated that several defensive positions were critically low on ammunition, a situation their planners had not anticipated. Their stockpiles had been calculated for resisting a limited-scale assault, not the unprecedented intensity that unfolded. Supply logs show that some positions intended to sustain a 3-day defense exhausted their reserves within a matter of hours. German artillery units, the core of their defensive capabilities, encountered a similar crisis. Ammunition that had been meticulously rationed quickly disappeared under continuous bombardment. Attempts to transport reserve munitions forward were largely futile, as every supply route was relentlessly targeted by Allied fighter bombers. The disparity in firepower was stark. While German artillery units were limited to as few as 4 shells per gun per day by the afternoon of D-Day, American destroyers could unleash hundreds of rounds on a single target within minutes. Meanwhile, the German Armored Reserve, the force that senior commanders had insisted must decisively repel any beach invasion, remained immobilized during the most critical hours of the morning. The 21st Panzer Division, the only mechanized formation stationed near the coast, did not receive orders to engage until 1,000 hours, roughly 4 hours after the first Allied troops hit the beaches. When they finally moved at 1,620 hours, their advance ran between British airborne landing zones en route to the shoreline. Divisional records indicate that the unit reached the coast between Lyonnais and Luc-sur-Mer around 19:00 hours, marking the only German armored force to reach the beach on D-Day. However, the arrival of Operation Mallard at 2100 hours, consisting of 250 gliders delivering reinforcements to the British 6th Airborne Division, was interpreted as a significant threat to their flanks, prompting a withdrawal. By the end of the day, the division had lost approximately 54 tanks and armored vehicles, around 1/4 of its total strength. German troops also encountered unfamiliar Allied armored technology. The so-called Hobart's Funnies tanks, adapted with flails for mine clearance, flamethrowers, and bridging equipment, presented a type of combat capability they had never seen before. Throughout the day, German units struggled to respond to an entirely new scale of airborne operations, as British and American paratroopers operated deep behind their lines, creating confusion far exceeding their numerical strength. The 6th British Airborne Division and the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions sowed chaos across the battlefield, multiplying their effectiveness far beyond actual troop numbers. Friedrich von Ditter, Germany's most seasoned paratroop commander attached to the 6th Valga Regiment, observed the invasion firsthand and later recounted his conclusions in post-war interviews. He emphasized the unprecedented nature of the Allied airborne operations. They were massive, coordinated, and well-supplied. Where German units deployed small battalions with limited aircraft support, the Allies dropped entire divisions with continuous streams of gliders and transport planes. The psychological impact on German forces was severe. Soldiers frequently froze in place, afraid of ambushes, while others fired indiscriminately, sometimes targeting their own men. Such disorientation exacerbated existing logistical and tactical difficulties, accelerating the breakdown of German command and control. Allied air operations systematically targeted and destroyed communication networks, while French resistance groups, activated by coded BBC messages, sabotaged telephone lines and relay stations, further crippling German coordination. By the end of D-Day, German defenses had been systematically overwhelmed by both the scale and sophistication of the invasion, leaving few coherent units capable of mounting effective counterattacks. On June 6th, Allied electronic warfare units successfully disrupted German radio communications across Normandy. General Lieutenant Max Pemmel, serving as Chief of Staff for the 7th Army, struggled to maintain coordination from his command post in Lamar. His war diary reflects mounting frustration as contact with frontline units progressively disappeared. By midday, entire divisions were effectively cut off from headquarters, forcing individual commanders to operate independently, unaware of the broader tactical situation. As night fell on D-Day, German defenders assessed the rapidly deteriorating situation. The once formidable Atlantic Wall had been penetrated at multiple points. The Luftwaffe was virtually non-existent over the invasion area, unable to provide air support. German coastal forces managed to sink one U.S. destroyer, the USS Corey, but in doing so lost 15 E-boats and numerous smaller vessels. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Riecher, leading the 716th Division, which had endured the heaviest portion of the British assault, reported the following status to 7th Army Command. The division was operating at only 35% combat capacity. All coastal fortifications had been captured by the enemy, and artillery units had suffered 90% losses. The German front was being steadily pushed inland. These figures reveal the scale of tactical collapse. Despite isolated acts of valor, German forces endured casualties on a scale comparable to the heaviest battles of the war, while Allied troops continued to land fresh forces, treating D-Day as a starting point rather than a climactic engagement. Through the night of June 6-7, German units attempted to reorganize and launch counterattacks, but the full extent of Allied dominance quickly became evident. German movements were consistently detected by radar, targeted with flares, and subjected to accurate artillery and naval gunfire. The Hans von Lux Panzer Grenadier units, finally dispatched to counterattack towards Sword Beach, encountered immediate exposure. Memoirs from soldiers describe how parachute flares illuminated the battlefield, turning the night into a scene of daylight and enabling devastatingly precise fire from offshore destroyers. Half of the attacking force was lost without engaging a single enemy soldier. Meanwhile, Allied reinforcements continued to arrive, with artificial harbors being assembled and supply ships anchored in orderly formations. The invasion was not merely advancing, it was establishing a permanent foothold. German reinforcements attempting to reach Normandy faced near-total disruption. Roads, railways, and bridges were constantly targeted, severely delaying troop movements. Records from the Wehrmacht indicate that units expected to reach the front in a single day took up to 2 weeks. The Das Reich division of the SS, stationed near Toulouse, required 17 days to arrive at Normandy, a journey that should have taken 3, losing nearly a third of their vehicles to air attacks without engaging in ground combat. This logistical failure had profound psychological effects. If reinforcements could not even arrive intact, their ability to impact the battle was nullified. Allied supply operations were marked by exceptional efficiency. Landing ship, tanks, LSTs, delivered entire armored regiments within hours, and within days the Allies were bringing in 15,000 tons of supplies daily, exceeding the total weekly consumption of the German forces in the region. By June 12th, German forces in Normandy were nearing a state of psychological collapse. They had suffered roughly 26,000 casualties, equivalent to the losses of 2 full divisions, while replacements were scarce. In contrast, Allied strength continued to increase steadily. On June 12th, Carentan fell, linking Utah and Omaha beaches. Elite German paratroopers of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, units that had never previously retreated, were forced to withdraw in disorder. The cumulative impact of relentless Allied attacks, superior logistics, and overwhelming control of the battlefield ensured that German forces were unable to stabilize the front, marking the early phase of the Normandy campaign as a decisive turning point. Colonel Friedrich Fonda, addressing his superiors, admitted that his regiment had ceased to function as an effective combat unit, stating that those who survived were mentally shattered and incapable of coherent military action. On June 13th, SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann achieved one of the few notable tactical successes for Germany in the Normandy campaign. British military records indicate that in the course of the engagement near Villers-Bocage, Wittmann destroyed between 13 and 14 Allied tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and 13 to 15 armored personnel carriers, all within a mere 15 minutes. The Nazi propaganda apparatus seized upon this episode as evidence that German forces could still deliver decisive blows. However, the victory underscored the harsh reality of the situation. The German army struggled to replace the Tiger tank Wittmann lost in the skirmish, whereas the British were able to replenish their losses within hours. Individual skill and tactical ingenuity could not offset the overwhelming numerical and industrial superiority of the Allies. Wittmann himself, credited with 138 confirmed tank kills across multiple fronts, met his end on August 8 when his Tiger tank was destroyed, whether by the fire of British gunner Joe Ekins or by Canadian units remains uncertain. This event highlighted the disproportionate cost for Germany. One Tiger could be traded for 10 Allied tanks without significant strategic impact. The capture of Cherbourg on June 26 further demonstrated the collapse of German defensive expectations. This heavily fortified port, defended over 4 years and garrisoned with 21,000 men, was intended to hold out for months but fell after only 5 days of sustained combat. General Lieutenant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, commander of the garrison, had vowed to defend the city to the last bullet, yet he surrendered quickly, later explaining during post-war interrogation that resistance had become futile against an enemy capable of limitless reinforcement, a recurring theme in German accounts of the Normandy campaign. The decisive blow came with Operation Cobra, which began on July 25. According to official U.S. Army Air Forces records, the preparatory bombardment involved 1,530 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers, delivering over 4,100. General Leutnant Fritz Beilheim, commanding a panzer division, reported to Army Group B that his unit had been effectively obliterated, noting that the survivors were psychologically devastated and no longer capable of functioning as soldiers. The intensity of the bombardment was such that Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater, lost his life despite observing from what was presumed to be a safe distance. If American commanders could fall victim to their own firepower, German troops stood virtually no chance of survival. The so-called Falaise Pocket, spanning August 12 to 20 Honest, became the final grave of German resistance in Normandy. Allied intelligence reports, corroborated by post-war German records, estimated that roughly 10,000 German soldiers were killed and 50,000 captured in this encirclement. More than 300 tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed, alongside 2,500 support vehicles. Eyewitness accounts from those attempting to escape describe a scene of catastrophic devastation, roads littered with corpses of horses and burning wrecks, while Allied fighter-bombers struck in relentless waves every 20 minutes, accompanied by continuous artillery fire. The magnitude of destruction led many German soldiers to surrender voluntarily, preferring captivity over certain annihilation. Ultimately, the Normandy campaign concluded as a comprehensive defeat for Germany. From June 6 to August 30 German forces suffered staggering casualties, equipment losses, and the systematic collapse of their capacity to resist, illustrating the overwhelming impact of Allied industrial power and coordinated military strategy on the battlefield. The human cost of the Normandy campaign was staggering. Around 320,000 German soldiers were rendered combat ineffective, including roughly 30,000 killed, 80,000 wounded, and approximately 210,000 either missing or taken prisoner. German armored forces suffered catastrophic losses, with 2,300 tanks destroyed, effectively erasing almost all their mechanized capability in France. The Luftwaffe experienced a similar fate, losing 2,127 aircraft, while Allied losses, by contrast, amounted to 29,672 casualties. The Allies had the capacity to replenish these losses almost daily, restoring about 4,000 tanks within weeks and replacing more than 4,000 aircraft from a fleet that exceeded 13,000 planes. This numerical imbalance underscored a crucial reality. Germany was engaged in a struggle it could not sustain, facing an adversary whose material resources were virtually limitless. German officers on the ground, tasked with evaluating the unfolding disaster, offered the most unvarnished assessments. General Diensttruppen Heinrich Aberbach, who assumed command in Normandy after Field Marshal Rommel was incapacitated, reported to the High Command, OKW, on August, emphasizing the stark disparity. The Allies possessed at least a 20-to-1 advantage in artillery, a 10-to-1 advantage in tanks, and total dominance in the air. They can replace all losses within days, he noted. We cannot replace anything. General Hans Bedell, Rommel's chief of staff, reflected in his 1949 memoir that Normandy demonstrated how bravery alone could not counterbalance industrial might. The German army faced an opponent whose strength lay not only in mechanized combat, but in the industrial machinery that produced victory itself. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in his final dispatch to Hitler on July 15, just 2 days before suffering severe injuries from Allied air attacks, conveyed the grim reality. Our forces fight with valor at every point, yet the imbalance in men and equipment is decisive. Immediate recognition of this situation is essential. In essence, Rommel was communicating the inevitability of defeat, acknowledging that the war could no longer be salvaged through courage alone. The Normandy operations revealed that World War II had become a conflict dominated by production capacity. German soldiers encountered American industrial power on a scale previously unimaginable. At Ford's Willow Run facility, a B-24 bomber was rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes during peak operations. Across 1,944, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. Daily Allied ammunition expenditure alone surpassed Germany's monthly output, while a single US division consumed more material daily than an entire German army corps. Hans von Luck, recalling the campaign in his memoir, emphasized, "We discovered that modern warfare depended not on tactical skill or heroism, but on the relentless output of industrial systems." Victory had been mechanized. The psychological impact on German troops was profound. Survivors of Normandy confronted the collapse of long-held beliefs about military doctrine, racial hierarchy, and national destiny. Hinrich Seo, a machine gunner in Unit WN62, reflected decades later on the lasting imprint of D-Day. In his 2005 memoir, he recounted his interactions with American veterans and the realization that German forces had been thrown into a massive, unrelenting industrial slaughter. "The 13,500 rounds I carried meant nothing against an enemy that could endlessly replace its losses," he wrote, highlighting the stark and unyielding nature of the conflict. Normandy was not merely a battlefield. It was a demonstration that the outcome of modern war was dictated less by courage and more by the scale and efficiency of industrial production. The campaign transformed the perception of warfare for German soldiers, leaving a lasting recognition that technological and manufacturing supremacy had become the ultimate arbiter of victory. After World War II, Friedrich von der Heydte, once a commander of paratroopers, transitioned into a career as a professor of international law. Reflecting on the Normandy campaign, he concluded that the age of individual military heroes had ended. Combat was no longer determined by personal bravery or tactical ingenuity alone. It had become a test of industrial might. The German assault against the Allies on D-Day had been fought with outdated strategies and insufficient resources, confronting a foe whose capacity for production and logistics dwarfed anything Germany could muster. From the German perspective, the Normandy landings were not merely a tactical loss. They represented a profound collapse of ideology and morale. Veterans who had once overrun vast portions of Europe found their assumptions about the enemy, their cause, and their own capabilities catastrophically wrong. They had anticipated weak, fragmented democracies, but instead faced a coalition that had mechanized war to a level of staggering efficiency. The German defenders of the beaches bore witness to what could be described as the industrialization of warfare. They observed entire fleets of ships, squadrons of aircraft, columns of tanks, and an unending flow of supplies, all generated by factories operating at levels beyond German understanding. Modern conflict, it became clear, was determined less by the valor of individual soldiers than by the productive capacity of entire nations. Success in battle had become a function of manufacturing output, logistics, and the ability to sustain operations over time rather than isolated feats of heroism. Heinrich Seeau, commanding German forces on June 6, had anticipated repelling the invasion within hours. By the day's end, he found himself surrounded by spent ammunition and overwhelmed by continuous waves of Allied reinforcements streaming onto beaches his units were meant to hold. His personal ordeal mirrored the wider tragedy facing Germany in Normandy. Localized tactical proficiency was utterly powerless against a foe whose strategic resources were virtually limitless. The Normandy coast was not just a scene of combat, it became a stark revelation. German soldiers confronted the future of armed conflict, witnessing firsthand that the nations able to organize and supply war on an industrial scale held the decisive advantage. Courage, discipline, and training were rendered largely irrelevant in the face of sheer material abundance. While German troops exhausted their weapons and ammunition, the Allies simply replenished their losses with inexhaustible supply chains. The lessons were brutal but unmistakable. In an era dominated by industrialized warfare, even the most skilled and determined soldiers could not overcome a deficit in production. Germany's defeat in Normandy was comprehensive. It shattered illusions of military invincibility and exposed the limits of Nazi ideology when confronted with the full force of Allied industrial power. Soldiers who had begun the day as confident representatives of the Third Reich ended it as witnesses to a level of organizational and material efficiency they could scarcely comprehend. The invasion, initially predicted to fail, swept German forces aside, erasing both tactical positions and the remnants of any hope for victory. The experience demonstrated that, in the modern age, victory belonged to those who could sustain relentless output, organize massive operations, and maintain supply lines that no single act of battlefield heroism could ever match. The arsenal of democracy, as the Allies' industrial machine came to be known, had proven its dominance with stark clarity, leaving the German military to confront a defeat that was total militarily, psychologically, and ideologically.